Madam President, I hope we can get the answer to these questions. If we can't, this isn't going to stop until we do. And these are just the preliminary questions. I will come back with some more in the coming weeks. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, I want to thank again the distinguished ranking member of the Finance Committee for his presentation and asking very pertinent questions with what I thought was going to be not an easy task, but at least a task that where we would receive cooperation from the IRS and from that matter, or for that matter, the administration. Nobody likes to be audited, and surely nobody likes to say they've been audited. The distinguished ranking members pointed out about all the conservative groups. Let me point out that this has gone on and as well to them as to individuals as well. We're getting reports from the Senatorial Campaign Committee indicating that the people are hesitant to give, that people have given in the past significantly to the Republican cause have been audited, and audited for the first time in their lives, to pro-Israel groups, and I can go on with a list of the organizations. This is a very serious situation. This really surprises me that having said we were going to do this in a painstaking bipartisan way, that this is simply not the case. And I'm going to be joining the distinguished ranking member and very interested in the further questions that we feel that we can boil down that simply have to be answered first, and then obviously there are many more. It really goes to the subject that I'd like to talk about, and that the American people now, as a result of this, do not trust the IRS, and they sure as heck do not trust the IRS to be in charge of their health care. And that's the subject I want to touch on, and I will try to make it very brief. It has been more than 3 years, Madam President, since the Affordable Health Care Act, referred to by some or most in the press as Obamacare, was signed into law. At the time, I can recall, after months of markup in both the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions and Finance Committees, I had many concerns. I remember I was very frustrated with my amendments being defeated on partisan votes. Most of them dealt with rationing. And I remember distinctly comparing this rush to government health care to a Western or Kansas analogy, to riding hell for leather into a box canyon, eventually to find the only alternative would be to turn around and ride back out to a more realistic, market-oriented health care reform trail. As it turned out, we never even saw the bill before we voted on it. I voted no, and so did every other Republican senator and member of Congress. And I regret to say that my colleagues, or to my colleagues, that I told you so. Premiums are going up, taxes are going up, overall health care costs continue to rise, and burdensome, costly, and I might add, difficult to understand regulations are confusing and confounding health care providers. Many of these folks will not even know about a particular regulation until they are fined by outside contractors. The results have been terribly counterproductive to any economic recovery. Regulations like this have a way of dampening anything that we're trying to do. The current and growing problems are so large and complicated with this government takeover of health care that it has been difficult, if not impossible, for the administration just to get Obamacare off the ground. Now, I mentioned what happened 3 years ago at the beginning of my remarks. Let's now talk about what's coming down the pike in a matter of weeks, just a matter of weeks. October 1st is the deadline when, according to the Affordable Health Care Act, according to the law, according to promise, millions of Americans who do not receive insurance through an employer will be forced to purchase health insurance in an exchange overseen by the states and the federal government, except for Georgia. Yesterday, Georgia was the first of exchanges to announce that they will not be ready by the October 1 deadline, and have asked for a delay. Now, I'm going to make a prediction. What Georgia did, others will do, including the federal government. In fact, as we all know, the administration, in a week-end blog no less, announced they would delay the employer mandate due to take place January 1, 2014, by a year to January of 2015. I might add that just happens to be after the midterm elections. This just means another delay. For businesses that complained about the red tape and costly burdens the mandate placed on their operations, many are already laying off employees or moving them to part-time status to avoid the costly mandate. And all of this follows the thousands of waivers granted to corporations and unions and other groups. And my question is again, where is the waiver for the average family in Kansas and around the nation? Where is the permanent delay for the taxes that will affect individuals? As we warned, things are starting to crumble and get worse, which is why we need to sunset the exchanges and individual mandates, literally a tax on families. Now, this evening, this afternoon probably, tomorrow, those of us privileged to serve in this Senate will leave Washington for the month of August. And we are going to get an earful regarding all of the problems associated with Obamacare and the impending deadline. Will the exchanges be ready? If they say they're ready, will they really be ready? Many Kansans who will be forced into a federal exchange or see another last-minute delay, a federal exchange, by the way, that doesn't exist as of my remarks, will ask how much their new plan will cost. They will say what it will cover. What will it cover? They will ask, will they be able to see their family doctor? Will their personal health information remain private and safe or end up in a 6-agency database? Some people have called it 7 agencies. Will they be losing the health insurance that they like? Will the high costs force their employer to make them a part-time employee, change their plan, or just drop their coverage altogether? Right now, Kansans and everyone else in the country cannot answer these questions, and neither can the administration. And when we get back, we will have only 4 weeks until the October 1 deadline. Now, that means, really, if we're going to do something about this, we're only going to have 3 weeks in which something can be done to sunset, delay, defund, or repeal the law and replace it with real health care reform that works and to restore the all-important relationship between patients and doctors. Well, I do have an answer, Madam President. Some time ago, when the Obamacare storm clouds were first forming, I introduced legislation to sunset the exchanges and the individual mandate if they are not, as promised, up and running, ready to roll, ready to enroll by October 1, so that the exchanges can meet the requirements prescribed by law. Simply named the Exchange Sunset Act of 2013, it's S. 1272. My bill aims to make sure that if the exchanges are not ready, they go away. And so does the mandate. Now, I realize as we travel down this road to the October 1 deadline at ever-increasing speed, there will be those who support continued advertising and encouraging thousands to sign up in the exchanges. The question is, sign up for what? The chances for the exchanges, state and federal, to be ready, and I mean ready, accessible to all that the advertising is trying to bring in, are remote at best. Obviously, there will be some kind of a delay. And once again, we will have the administration rewriting laws they had a direct hand in writing and were passed exclusively by the Democratic majority. I submit changing the law by the executive, the office of the President, without approval by the Congress is unconstitutional. 3 weeks. 3 weeks before the Obamacare train wreck. When this body comes back, I urge immediate consideration. Let's talk about it. Immediate consideration and hopefully passage of S-1272, the Exchange Sunset Act of 2013. It's a train wreck, folks, and we have to get America off the track. I yield back.
Madam President.
The Senator from Arizona.
I rise today to discuss the so-called grand bargain referenced yesterday by the President. On Tuesday, President Obama recycled a number of policy ideas that have lingered for months, if not years, and repackaged them as what he called a grand bargain. The proposal seems to be an attempt by the President to extend an olive branch to the Republican side of the aisle by offering corporate tax reform. In exchange, he is asking for additional stimulus spending. Mr. President, or Madam President, I'm all in favor of a grand bargain, but this is not even close to a grand bargain. It's not even a bargain. A grand bargain would involve reform to entitlement programs to make them sustainable over time. A grand bargain would involve a far-sighted look at the out years, not just a short-sighted attempt to score political points for the next election cycle. The administration has taken the taxpayer down the road of stimulus spending before with the idea that we can stimulate job growth with so-called shovel-ready projects. Sadly, we've all seen what throwing taxpayer money at supposed shovel readiness gets you, and just how lackluster this recovery has been. Wasting hard-earned dollars on so-called investments doesn't create jobs. People and the people who build them, businesses and the people who build them, that's what creates jobs. I think both sides of the aisle agree that our tax code is already far too complicated. In fact, a recent bipartisan letter from the chairman and ranking minority of the Senate Finance Committee discussed the complexity, the inefficiency, and the unfairness of our tax code. It acts as a brake on our economy. But if we can't bring ourselves to do entitlement reform or the so-called grand bargain, at least at this stage, what we can do is perhaps a small bargain for business and the taxpayers just by simplifying both the individual and corporate codes to foster an environment that's hospitable to business expansion, to hiring, and international competitiveness. Last week I shared publicly with the leadership of our tax writing committee my goals and principles for tax reform. Chief among them is lowering the business tax income for a corporation and those businesses that file as individuals, with 95% of U.S. businesses structured as Subchapter S corporations, limited partnerships, limited liability corporations, and other pass-through businesses. We can't ignore the fact that many of them pay at the top rate of 39.6%, in addition to several other layers of taxation. In my view, any substantive tax reform should include a reformed tax system that allows all U.S. businesses, including pass-through businesses, to thrive. Unfortunately, the proposed corporate taxation reforms that the President included in his recent announcement have again, it will have the government picking winners and losers in the tax code. Here in the Senate, there are efforts to work in a bipartisan fashion to reform the tax code. This is a good faith effort that should be encouraged. As I mentioned, it would be a bargain for taxpayers and businesses alike. Then who knows, if we can make progress on a small bargain, then perhaps someday we can return our attention to the grand bargain, a bargain that would include and involve entitlement reform and substantive tax reform in the same package. Madam President, I yield the floor.
So we do.
Madam President,
The Republican leader.
I ask that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
The Senate is not in a quorum call.
Madam
The
President,
senator is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 145, H.R. 2668. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read a third time and passed without intervening action or debate. The motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President, very briefly reserving the right to object.
Majority Leader.
It comes as no surprise that the Republicans are once again trying to repeal the Health Care Act. By one count, House and Senate Republicans have tried to fight the same fight more than 70 times. Albert Einstein was not insane. He was very, very smart. But he described insanity pretty clearly. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's where we are here. This is insane. It's clear Republicans liked it better when insurance companies could deny coverage if you had a pre-existing condition. They liked it better when insurance companies could cut off your health when you got sick. They liked it better when insurance companies could raise insurance rates without any review. And they would say now, I guess what they're saying now, they want to prevent enforcement of health care reform. What they're really saying is they want to repeal free mammograms and preventive care. They want to repeal the law that allows children to stay on their parents' health care until they're 26. Let's not fight the same fight over and over again. It's time to stop fighting. It's time to work together. I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate receives H.R. 2009, the Keep the IRS Off Your Health Care Act, the Senate proceed to its consideration, that the bill be read a third time and passed without intervening action or debate. The motion to reconsider be considered and made and laid upon the table.
Is there
object.
objection?
I object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President,
The Republican leader.
let me address the first consent that I offered, which was objected to. Last month, the administration announced it would delay Obamacare's employer mandate on businesses. It's not hard to see why they wanted to do that. We keep reading about how businesses, both large and small, will have little option but to cut employee hours and paychecks as Obamacare comes online. About how restaurants like White Castle, for example, are considering hiring only part-time workers moving forward. About how small businesses are citing Obamacare as a top worry. Now I think there are a lot of members on this side who would question the legality of what the President did. But with midterm elections on the horizon, it's no mystery why the administration would want to delay the law for businesses, considering how many jobs it's likely to kill, how many paychecks it's likely to slash. Here's the thing, though. Don't families and individuals deserve the same kind of relief? I believe they do. I don't believe it's fair to give a break to business and leave Americans out in the cold. I mean, just recently we learned that Ohioans buying health insurance next year can expect about a 40% premium increase. Next door in Indiana, costs could rise by more than 70%. Some Georgians could face a nearly 200% premium spike. In my home state of Kentucky, actuaries are predicting cost increases that could exceed 30%. Remember, the President said costs would go down, that Obamacare was the Affordable Care Act. And millions face the prospect of losing the insurance they like and want to keep, which again is not what the President promised. That's why I'll be asking, or have already asked, the Senate to pass H.R. 2668. This legislation passed the House on a strong bipartisan vote. Nearly 24 Democrats supported it, and it would delay some of Obamacare's most burdensome mandates for everyone. Shortly after its passage in the House, my colleagues and I called on Majority Leader to bring it to the floor for a vote. Those calls were unheeded. So I'm disappointed to hear that some of our friends on the other side have objected to this vote as well. I don't understand, frankly, why they'd want to leave Americans out in the cold. I would note that members on this side are united in our belief that at the very least, Americans deserve the same relief as businesses do. So we'll all be supporting this common sense bipartisan bill if we had a chance to vote on it. Really, you'd think this is a principle members in the body would support unanimously. If it's okay for businesses, why not for individuals? Well, unfortunately, objection has been heard, and we will not get an opportunity to have the same break for the average American citizen as the administration has given through executive action to businesses. It's a shame, but that's where we are going into the August recess. Madam President, I yield the floor. Madam President, it's with sorrow that I rise to pay tribute to a young man from Kentucky who gave his life in service to our country. Private First Class Dustin P. Napier of London, Kentucky, died on January the 8th, 2012 in Zabul Province, Afghanistan, while in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. The cause of death was injuries sustained from small arms fire. PFC Napier was 20 years old. For his service in uniform, PFC Napier received several awards, medals, and decorations, including the Bronze Star Medal, the Army Achievement Medal, the Army Good Conduct Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal with Bronze Service Star, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Army Service Ribbon, the Overseas Service Ribbon, the NATO Medal, the Combat Infantryman Badge, and the Overseas Service Bar. Dustin's father, Darrell Napier, says of his son, he was born in an Army hospital, and I'm sure he ended up dying in an Army hospital. He was my hero. Please pray for us. Dustin was born in an Army hospital because he followed his father's example of military service. Darrell Napier served in the U.S. Army from 1989 to 1994 and was stationed in Germany and Fort Polk, Louisiana. Dustin, the youngest of Darrell's three sons, knew from an early age he wanted a military career. He'd been wanting to do that since he was a little boy, about when he was 6 years old, Darrell recalls. I encouraged him to do so, and he was a leader. He'd take the initiative to get things done. I've always raised my voice to do the right thing, no matter if the cause was popular or unpopular. By the time he reached high school, Dustin was a top cadet in his junior ROTC program. I remember him as a model student, very quiet and serious. You always knew where he stood, says Colonel Mark Jones of the Air Force Junior ROTC program at South Laurel High School, Dustin's alma mater. Dustin rose to be his junior ROTC unit's corps commander and the most decorated cadet. News of PFC Napier's loss shook many who remembered him at South Laurel High, where Dustin graduated in 2010 and had many friends. When I heard he had died, my legs almost collapsed. It was unbelievable. He was a good friend, a good mentor, and a truly good person, says Devin Burkhart, a South Laurel student. I learned from him. He was the one who would tell me, stick with it, when I got frustrated with the program, and I did stick with it. Stephen Cheek, one of Dustin's best friends and a high school classmate, recalls the fun he and Dustin had shooting rifles, going to ball games, watching movies, and listening to music. Dustin's favorite group was The Doors. Other friends remember Dustin loved to play the air guitar. After graduating from South Laurel High in May 2010, Dustin joined the U.S. Army in July and completed basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. In April 2011, he was deployed to Afghanistan with C Company, 1st Battalion, 24th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division, based out of Fort Wainwright, Alaska. Darrell Napier recalls that Dustin would call home from Afghanistan every now and then. He did miss home a lot. He loved to hang out with his friends very much. He missed his friends at Save-A-Lot, where he worked for almost 4 years. And if there was one meal Dustin really loved from his mother, it was her chicken and dumplings. Dustin also found happiness thousands of feet in the air while on R&R. It was in an airplane that he met Tabitha Sturgill Napier, who he married in October of 2011. Remembering her husband, Tabitha says, "You are my very best friend. I love you very, very, very much. You are an amazing husband." A few days after his death, friends and classmates held a memorial service for Dustin at South Laurel High School. His friends from his old junior ROTC unit thought it only fitting to hold the service where Dustin had served as such a fine example to past, present, and future cadets. Outside the school, the American flag stood at half-mast. Cadet Napier came here with a purpose from start to finish, from the first fall in to the last fall out, says Chief Master Sergeant Randy Creech of Junior ROTC. Madam President, we're thinking of PFC Napier's loved ones today, including his wife, Tabitha Sturgill Napier, his parents, Darrell and Marianne Napier, his brother, Darrell Dean Napier, his stepbrother, Christopher Bittner, his stepson, Lane Robinson, his grandmother, Monica Paul, his grandfather, James Napier, and many other beloved friends and family members. I know that no words spoken in this chamber can take away the sadness and loss that Dustin's family must feel. But I do want them to know that this nation and this United States Senate are deeply grateful for Private First Class Dustin P. Napier's service and his sacrifice, and we are humbled to pay tribute to his life and to his legacy. Now, Madam President, finally, I'm going to insert my next comments in the record. They relate to current conditions in Burma, and I ask unanimous consent that these remarks appear in the record at this point as if delivered.
Without objection.
Thanks.
Madam President.
The Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I would also ask to insert the statement of Senator John McCain on the nomination of Samantha Power to be U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, turning to the matter upon which I ask unanimous consent and to which the Majority Leader objected, and that is to take up legislation that I've sponsored here in the Senate and which has been passed in the House, which is the Keep the IRS Off Your Health Care Act. With each passing day, it seems like more and more supporters of Obamacare are having second thoughts. As I mentioned last week, 3 of America's most powerful labor leaders have declared that the President's health care law is, quote, creating nightmare scenarios, close quote, and threatening to, quote, hurt millions of Americans, close quote. Those are some pretty remarkable words from people who were some of the foremost advocates for the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. Meanwhile, the union that represents IRS employees has announced that it does not want its members to receive health insurance through Obamacare exchanges. In fact, earlier today, the IRS commissioner himself said he wants to keep his current health care policy and does not want to sign up for Obamacare as millions of other Americans will be required to do. Speaking of the Internal Revenue Service, the agency's political targeting scandal continues to grow. I listened in my office to Senator Hatch, the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, the one primarily responsible for internal revenue oversight in the Senate. And I hope that the questions he posed will be answered by the bipartisan investigation that we are conducting. But we recently learned that the Internal Revenue Service's chief counsel's office, headed by an Obama administration appointee, was aware of the abuses. So much for a couple of rogue agents in Cincinnati, as originally was reported. We've also learned that IRS officials have improperly targeted not only conservative organizations, but political candidates and donors as well. And to make things worse, the same person who ran the IRS division that targeted conservative groups is now running the agency's Obamacare office. You know, you really can't make this stuff up. Truth is stranger than fiction. So Americans might be asking, what does the IRS have to do with Obamacare? Well, America's tax collection agency will be responsible for administering several of the law's most important provisions, including the individual mandate, which we've heard so much about, the employer mandate, which we've heard a lot about, and all of the subsidies, in other words, all the tax dollars that will go to fund the exchanges under Obamacare. Those will be administered by the Internal Revenue Service under the current law. It is remarkable, at a time when public trust in the Internal Revenue Service has plummeted, at a time when IRS officials are complaining that their staffers are overworked and overburdened, the Obama administration wants to use this tax agency to administer a massive new entitlement program affecting 1/6 of our national economy. To me, that sounds like another recipe for disaster. Back in May, I sponsored legislation that would prevent the Internal Revenue Service from a role in implementing Obamacare. Last week, I introduced it as an amendment to the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill that was pending before this chamber. Congressman Tom Price of Georgia has introduced a similar bill in the House of Representatives, and unfortunately, this is pretty amazing. Even before the House passed the House bill, before the Senate had a chance to take up the Senate bill, President Obama has already issued a veto threat were we to pass it. Sounds a little defensive to me, but I understand that Obamacare is a deeply divisive issue here in Washington, and I understand that while many have who've compelled to defend the law previously are now feeling a little skittish about it 3 years later. But I'd ask my colleagues this. Given all we've learned about corruption and institutional abuse at the Internal Revenue Service, does anyone really believe we should dramatically expand the agency's power to implement Obamacare? Does anyone really believe that IRS agents should have access to even more personal financial information about, not to mention medical information, about American citizens? If IRS officials conducted a systemic campaign of political targeting against conservative organizations, why should we have any more confidence that the agency will fairly and objectively implement the President's health care law? Remember, the IRS has already announced that it will violate the text of the law and issue health care subsidies through federal exchanges. You recall what happened is many states said, we will pass on state-based insurance exchanges upon which Obamacare depends to be implemented in the states. So what the IRS has said, we're going to paper over the fact that Congress never explicitly authorized tax dollars to subsidize the federal exchanges, even though the law clearly states that those subsidies can be issued only through the state exchanges. Another example of lawlessness when it comes to Obamacare. In other words, the agencies that has already shown utter contempt for the rule of law when it comes to implementing President's most cherished legislative accomplishment, they have already shown that contempt, and they don't deserve, nor have they shown themselves worthy of our confidence when it comes to implementing this health care law. In my view, the IRS has absolutely no business playing such a huge role in the American health care system. For that matter, I'd ask my friends on the other side of the aisle one final question. Do you still believe that Obamacare will reduce health care costs? After all, it's estimated the law will cause a dramatic spike in individual insurance premiums across the country, from Maryland to Florida, to Indiana to Ohio, to Kentucky and Missouri to Idaho and California. Earlier this week, for example, the Florida Insurance Commissioner predicted that because of Obamacare, the cost of health insurance in the individual market in Florida will increase by 30 to 40%. And that's because of the provisions in Obamacare which mandate not only the guaranteed issue of health insurance even after you're sick, something someone compared to waiting until your house is on fire to buy health insurance. Well, it's not insurance anymore, and it drives up the cost. Not to mention the fact that young people, like those sitting here in front of me, they are going to have to pay the price of subsidizing health care for older Americans because of the so-called age banding requirements, which don't allow older citizens to pay any more than 3 times what young people pay for health insurance, even though their cost of their health care, given their age, will be higher. So this is what distorts the insurance markets, which is causing health insurance premiums to skyrocket across the states because of Obamacare. Rather than make our individual health insurance markets even more distorted and more dysfunctional than they are today, we should dismantle Obamacare and replace it with patient-centered reforms that create a genuine national marketplace for health insurance. I was just reading a story about an Oklahoma surgical center which publishes the price of common procedures for the public to read, and which now has created what markets always do, greater consumer awareness about what exactly these procedures cost. And as we've seen in Medicare Part D, that's the prescription drug plan that Congress passed a few years ago, when you create a market, when you have vendors compete for consumers' business, you're going to see prices go down. You're going to see quality of service to go up. That's what markets do, and they benefit the consumer, and they would benefit the taxpayer and patients as well. But what do I mean by patient-centered reforms? I'm talking about reforms that empower individual Americans by giving them more choices and flexibility in health care markets. That's what I was giving an example of with that Oklahoma Surgical Care Center. By giving them more transparent information about pricing and quality, by directly assisting people with pre-existing conditions. I heard the majority leader earlier when Senator McConnell offered a unanimous consent request to extend the moratorium on the individual mandate, just as the President has unilaterally on the employer mandate. And he said something about, well, Republicans want people to be subjected to pre-existing condition exclusions and not covered. Well, that's just simply false. You don't have to embrace 2,700 pages of Obamacare just to take care of that problem or other problems that we have agreement on. But we should also work to protect the doctor-patient relationship. And the last thing we ought to do on my list of things to do to reform the health care system is to save Medicare from bankruptcy. It is on an unsustainable path, and yet any time we try to suggest reforms that will strengthen and stabilize Medicare and make sure it's there for future generations, they're met with a stiff arm. If we want to reduce health care costs, if we want to expand quality insurance coverage, and give Americans more choices and options, we should equalize the tax treatment for health insurance, so it's treated the same whether it's provided by your employer or whether you go buy it yourself. We should let individuals and businesses form risk pools in the individual market, and we should let folks buy health insurance across state lines. Why shouldn't I be able to buy health insurance in New Hampshire or in Alabama or somewhere else if it fits my needs? Right now, that's not possible, and it would create a market which would create competition and bring down costs and make it more affordable. And yes, we should expand tax-free health savings accounts so people can save their own money and spend it as they see fit on their health care, and if they don't spend it there, it's available for their retirement, much like any other individual retirement account. And we should curb frivolous medical malpractice lawsuits. According to one study, the annual cost of defensive medicine is a staggering $210 billion. In my state, we've had a lot of success with medical malpractice reform. It's stabilized the cost of medical malpractice insurance that physicians have to buy, and it's created a huge surplus of physicians who want to move to Texas and practice their profession because they realize they won't lose everything they had in the litigation lottery. And they can buy affordable coverage that will protect their family and, yes, their patients should they make mistakes. And we should give each state much more flexibility to design a Medicaid program that works best for their neediest residents. Now, Medicaid is a wonderful program, but it's broken. This is designed to protect the most vulnerable people in our society and provide for their health care needs. But because of the broken Medicaid program in my state, only 1 out of every 3 doctors will actually see a new Medicaid patient because it reimburses at about half of what private insurance would. So many doctors simply can't afford to see a new Medicaid patient. So what you have is the appearance of coverage, but you have no real access to the doctor of your choice. So we need to fix Medicaid. And finally, we should establish greater provider competition in Medicare so that the competition that I mentioned a moment ago in the Medicare prescription drug program can also apply in other aspects of Medicare and help make it more affordable and to shore it up and guarantee its availability to generations yet to come. There's no reason why Americans have to accept an unworkable health care law administered by an agency like the Internal Revenue Service that has grossly abused its power and demonstrated that its current job is way beyond its capacity to perform. I realize we won't be able to dismantle Obamacare overnight, not with President Obama still in the White House and with Democratic majorities here in the United States Senate. And I realize that many of these issues need to be debated further. But I hope we would all be able to agree that the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, should not be administering a law that affects 1/6 of our national economy and which so dramatically affects the quality of life for 320 million Americans. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Alabama.
Thank you, Madam President. Last week in Illinois, President Obama attempted to blame opponents of the Obamacare for the law's broken promises. He lashed out at what he called folks out there who are actively working to make this law fail, his words. And he further said, politically motivated misinformation campaign is afoot. And he strongly implied that fault rests not with those who conceive the law, but those who have not, in his estimation, his words again, committed themselves to making it work. Think about it a minute. This flailing, of course, was nothing more than an effort by President Obama to dodge and deflect accountability for the law that bears his name. Let's be real, Madam President. Obamacare is not a failure because so many Americans reject it. Rather, so many Americans reject Obamacare because it is a failure. Madam President, I believe we should focus. Americans are growing increasingly anxious about how the law will affect them and their families. They wonder what it will mean for their health insurance and tax bills. They wonder whether they will be able to get the care they need when they need it. They wonder whether the quality of American health care will remain the best in the world. And yes, they wonder how a government reorganization of 1/6 of the economy will impact a weak jobs market. Unfortunately, Madam President, neither the outset nor the outlook provides consolation. President Obama has frequently sought to downplay the debacle surrounding the rollout of his health care law. He says, and I'll quote, that glitches and bumps are to be expected. But as the Wall Street Journal columnist Kimberly Strassel notes, the Democrats didn't count on the hiccups turning into cardiac arrest. That's what's happened. Since the enactment of Obamacare, a laundry list of unworkable provisions has been repealed or delayed. But just recently, the administration announced two particularly notable delays. First, the administration will delay implementation of the law's employer mandate until 2015 because workable reporting requirements are not yet in place. This provision requires all employers in this country with more than 50 employees to provide adequate health care coverage for full-time employees, defined as those employed at least 30 hours per week, or pay a penalty. In anticipation of this mandate, many employers are cutting back hours for current workers and holding off on hiring new ones. Madam President, I welcome any relief from Obamacare for anyone in this country. But why should such relief not apply to individuals and families as well as business? And if the administration hasn't gotten its act together by now, what leads us to believe that it ever will? Instead of temporarily delaying part of Obamacare for some, I believe the best course would be to permanently delay all of it for everyone. The administration also recently announced postponement of a critical taxpayer protection under Obamacare. Taxpayers were previously told that the government would verify that applicants actually qualify for subsidies before receiving them. Now, the administration says it's not ready to do that until 2015, although it will still go ahead with enrollment in the program in 2014. So for the coming year, the Obama administration will trust but not verify anything. The honor system, I believe, is no taxpayer protection here. These are not just run-of-the-mill glitches and bumps, as the President would say. These provisions are central to the legislation and may foreshadow major problems to come, as we find out every day. These provisions are unworkable or problematic not because people don't like them, but because they were poorly designed. This isn't about a lack of commitment on behalf of those forced to comply with these mandates. Rather, it's about a lack of competence on behalf of those who conceived and crafted these provisions. But in light of the disastrous rollout of Obamacare, Americans are also apprehensive about the cost. Yes, the cost. How will all of this impact their health insurance premiums? What will be the tax burden? What will a new entitlement program do to our $17 trillion debt, which is growing? With respect to premiums, President Obama told the American people that his health care overhaul, quote, could save families $2,500 in the coming years. Those are his words. But despite this bold claim, health insurance premiums for the average American family have increased by over $3,000 since 2008, And this is according to the Kaiser Family Foundation Employer Health Benefits Survey, which is very well respected. Moreover, a recent Wall Street Journal analysis finds that premiums for healthy consumers could double or even triple under Obamacare. Can you imagine that? Although Obamacare has not decreased premiums, it's certainly increased taxes. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and the Joint Committee on Taxation, Obamacare imposes a $1 trillion tax hike on the American economy over just the first 10 years, $1 trillion tax hike. Their analysis finds 21 tax hikes in Obamacare due to the law's various mandates and restrictions. Among these, several affect individuals making less than $200,000 and married couples making less than $250,000, a clear violation of President Obama's oft-repeated campaign promise not to do so. But despite this massive tax hike, Obamacare will still add $6.2 trillion, yes, $6.2 trillion to the debt in the years ahead. But this is based on the Government Accountability Office projections. This clearly violates yet another promise by the President that he would not, and I'll quote his words, not sign a plan that adds one dime to our deficits, either now or in the future. Goodness. Madam President, I believe that the Obamacare will not only fail to control costs, is evident here, but also to destroy the best quality health care in the world, ours. And why do I say this? In 2009, Martin Feldstein, Dr. Feldstein, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Reagan and a Harvard professor, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Obamacare is all about rationing." He backed up this statement by citing a report issued by the President Obama's own Council of Economic Advisors, which explained how the President would propose to reduce health spending by eliminating certain treatments, by rationing. Dr. Feldstein went on to compare the Obama strategy to that of the British National Health Service. He concluded that the existence of such a program in the U.S. would not only deny life-saving care, but would also cast a pall over medical researchers who would fear that government experts might reject their discoveries as, quote, too expensive. Madam President, think of the implications of rationing health care. What does it mean for a patient sitting in the doctor's office when they get a life-changing diagnosis? I know that feeling. I've been there. It reassured me to know that we have the best health care in the world and that everything possible will be done to save my life. I want others who encounter that situation to have the same reassurance, but will they? And despite what President Obama may say, it's not just Republicans who have deep concerns about health care. Just this week, on the same Wall Street Journal opinion pages, Howard Dean, a former Democratic National Committee chairman and governor, also a physician, concurred with Dr. Feldstein. Mr. Dean wrote that Obamacare's Independent Payment Advisory Board, IPAB, quote, is essentially a health care rationing body. And by setting doctor reimbursement rates for Medicare and determining which procedures and drugs will be covered and at what price, the IPAB will be able to stop certain treatments its members do not favor by simply setting rates to levels where no doctor or hospital will perform them. That was the plan. Mr. Dean went on to say, these kinds of schemes do not control costs. The medical system simply becomes more bureaucratic. We all know now that the Obamacare is a bureaucratic nightmare, Madam President. With more than 20,000 pages of new rules and regulations, The law expands government to an unprecedented level, creating, yes, 159 new boards, commissions, and government offices. Think of it. Adding to these concerns, Deloitte's 2013 survey of U.S. physicians finds that due to recent developments in health care, the future of the medical profession as we know it may be in jeopardy as it loses clinical autonomy and compensation. The survey by Deloitte also found that 6 in 10 physicians, 6 in 10, say that it's likely that many physicians will retire earlier than planned in the next 1 to 3 years. Again, sitting in that doctor's office, I remember breathing a little easier to know that we have not only the most advanced treatments, but also the most skilled and experienced physicians in the world. We don't want to jeopardize that, do we, Madam President? In addition to concerns about the quality of care, the Obama administration has backtracked on still another of the President's promises. In 2009, he stated unambiguously, and I'll quote, "If you like your doctor, you will be able to keep your doctor, period," the President's words. But despite this pledge, the Department of Health and Human Services under the Obama administration recently posted the following on healthcare.gov, and I quote, they said, "Depending on the plan you choose in the marketplace, you may be able to keep your current doctor." May be able to keep your doctor, Mr. President. That's not what you told the American people. A University of Chicago study underscores this, finding that more than half of current individual insurance plans do not meet Obama's care standard to be sold on the exchanges. So much for that ironclad promise, Mr. President. But there's another area. Obamacare is a job killer. How will Obamacare affect jobs? In President Obama's recent Illinois speech that I mentioned earlier, he made the following but curious statement about Republicans and job creations. I'll quote, "They bring up Obamacare despite the fact that our businesses have created nearly twice as many jobs in this recovery as they had at the same point in the last recovery, when there was no Obamacare." Mr. President, this is not right. At a minimum, President Obama implied that Obamacare has not hurt job creation. At worst, he implied it has helped. In stark contrast, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce second quarter 2013 small business survey in America finds that 71% of small businesses, and that's the job creation machine in this country, say that the health care law makes it harder to hire. The same survey finds that 1/2 of small businesses say that they will either cut hours to reduce full-time employees or replace full-time employees with part-time workers to avoid the Obama mandate. In addition, Gallup finds that 41% of small business owners say they have held off on hiring new employees in response to Obamacare. Madam President, the one-year delay on Obamacare's employer mandate provides momentary relief. But in light of sustained high unemployment in this country, I find it deeply troubling that perhaps the best thing President Obama has done for American business during his time in office to provide only a brief reprieve from his own signature achievement. Notably, Madam President, labor unions agree with businesses now that the Obamacare will hurt the economy. Recently, in a scathing letter to Democratic leaders in Congress, the presidents of the Teamsters Union, the UFCW, and Unite Here wrote that Obamacare, and I will quote, "will shatter not only our hard-earned health benefits, but destroy the foundation of the 40-hour work week that is the backbone of the American middle class." Madam President, this brings me full circle to where I began my remarks. President Obama conveniently blames Republican opposition for the stumbles and failures of Obamacare, despite the fact that Americans across the political spectrum have spoken up about its many, many flaws. President Obama rammed his health care legislation through Congress without a single Republican vote. Why? Because he knew he didn't need our votes to put the entire nation under his health care plan then. Yet now, he claims that Obamacare works for those who are committed to it. Committed to it? Madam President, Republicans are committed to finding solutions that actually lower health costs, that do not tax and spend us into oblivion, that preserve the world's highest quality health care, and that foster economic growth. We've said all along that Obamacare would fail on each of these counts. And I believe that opposition to Obamacare is not responsible for its failures, and the commitment to it will not negate its deep flaws. The only way to achieve the goals we all share is to begin by repealing this failed law so we can replace it with a plan that works. I hope we can. I yield the floor. So, absence of a quorum.